So definitely check that out, and thank you guys for coming.
Okay, can you all hear me? Yes? I tend to mumble a little, so please shout at me if you can't hear me. Thanks everyone for coming. Thanks Rebecca and Hall Walls for inviting me to do this talk. When I got the invitation, I had known about the series, and I was like, I don't know if I can pick one artist to do a talk. This is like a big pressure, especially for a curator. So at the time, I had known about Robert Coles, the architect, and I known about some of his work. And we had just done a project. I almost say I had just done a project at Utica Station, the Metro Rail station, which you'll see in a minute, which was designed by Coles. And so I thought it would be an interesting kind of research project for myself to kind of take a look at it. And I had known that El Museo had actually presented an exhibition of his work at the History Museum back in 2002. So there was a little bit of a foundation there for me to look into. And so that's who I picked. I studied architecture at UB. So this is something that I've been I've known about and I've been thinking about, and I've been also thinking about bringing some architecture programming to El Museo, and so this was a little fun side project for me. I'm just gonna talk. I should probably set a timer. Okay, I'm just gonna talk real quick about his life and work, and then I have a ton of pictures that we can kind of look at. Most of the material in this talk comes from this book, Architecture and Advocacy. This is, in some ways, a monograph or a memoir that was, it was compiled and edited by William Senior and Sylvia Coles, Bob Coles' wife, but it is really written by him in essence. So I'm just gonna follow the book for the first half of the talk, and then we'll take a look at some of the architecture. You'll notice that the book is titled Architecture and Advocacy. And this is a big kind of thread that goes through his work. And it was interesting to me in reading this book and looking at some of the other materials that exist, and also in talking with him, that he doesn't actually talk very much about the architecture itself or the forms or the designs itself. And so that's going to be kind of the second half of the talk, is just some stray thoughts and some research notes. All right. So without further ado, this is Robert Coles, Robert Traynham Coles, FAIA. FAIA, for those of you who don't know, is a fellow of the American Institute of Architects, and it is considered to be basically the highest honor that an American architect can get in the field. This is his book. I should probably, oh, too far. He was born in 1929 in Buffalo, and he lived in the Cold Springs neighborhood. At the time, they were the only black family in really a majority working class neighborhood. His parents attended Hampton Institute, now Hampton University. His father was a postal worker. And there are a few stories in here that kind of lay out the roots of his advocacy work. I'm just gonna, at points, I'm gonna read to you from the book a little, so if you don't mind. He reflected on his experience at Public School 8. In the first grade, his teacher cast him as the wild man of Borneo in the school play. On hearing about this, his mother promptly marched to the school and told the teacher that no son of hers was going to play the wild man of Borneo. And so this was, in some ways, a kind of foundational experience. He attended Buffalo's Technical High School. I think that's Hutch Tech today. And then he was originally going to study engineering, but he was placed in building design, which was really a pathway for the trades and not a professional practice. And he had known about John Brent, who's the first black architect in Buffalo. and he thought that this might be an interesting path to go on. And this is something that he recalls a teacher telling him in high school. You can see, but I guess for someone who's going to be an architect, this wasn't going to do it. So after that, he followed his parents' desire, and he attended the Hampton Institute for a little while, but he said that he didn't feel sufficiently academically challenged, and he kind of bristled at discrimination in the South. And so he eventually transferred to the University of Minnesota, where he got his BA in 1951 and Bachelor of Architecture in 1953. And he talks about how he was the only black student there. And in some of my conversations with him, he had talked about how as a kid he grew up in a fairly kind of integrated environment, and he didn't think about himself as different or as other. And it was only through kind of experiences in later that he would have this awakening. He talks a bit about how he used to think of himself as an architect who was black, but eventually over the course of his career, he would define himself as a black architect. So let's see. A couple years after he graduated from Minnesota, he actually worked for a friend's father's firm, and they designed this building. It's the Richfield State Bank. I couldn't find any other information about it, but you can see this is a kind of very early modernist design. You have this kind of plinth on top. This is another picture that I found on someone's web diary. I don't know, people used to write these things about how he opened his first savings account in 1966 or something. At Minnesota, he met his now wife, Sylvia Coles. They've been married for over 60 years. And she recalls that he was the second black person she ever met. The first one was a partner of one of her friends, and they had met at a club in Minnesota, and they met in 1952, and they got married in 1953, which, today it seems unremarkable, but I can only imagine how radical that was back in the 50s. And it talks about she's been his partner in life and in business. The book describes how she was an essential, albeit at times reluctant, partner in business and the struggle for social justice. She took on many roles in his many endeavors, and she herself has written a book about her life. It's a memoir called Living with an Architect and Finding Myself. If you are an architect or if you know any architects, you will have an idea of what an interesting experience this may have been. But you can buy that on Amazon. So then after graduating from Minnesota, he attended MIT, where he was 1 out of 20 students in the entering class and the only black student. He was encouraged by one of his mentors that he had met at Minnesota, which was Buckminster Fuller, to go there. And at that time, he won a traveling scholarship with this design. It's called National Chain Roadside Restaurant. This enabled him to study architecture in Europe. Him and Sylvia traveled there for a year, went through 10 countries. There you can see them with their infant son in 55. This is a station wagon. It's a pretty cool picture. These are all scans from his book, by the way, so if you want to see these pictures, you can go get the book. And this was at the time when European cities were still kind of rebuilding after World War II. And so there was this idea of architecture and urban planning as a way of taming the city and really creating what's called civilizing urban spaces. And so this, at least in this telling, had a really foundational impact on his thinking about architecture, about cities. We went a little too far. And then he talks about how midway through the first year, the entire group of 20 students got bored studying Frederick Law Olmsted's Back Bay Fens. They invited the dean and the graduate school chairman to a party and requested that they bring in 6 well-known architects from a list of 30 and invite them to do a month of critiques. These included Eero Saarinen, Louis Kahn, John Johansson, Minoru Yamasaki, Eduardo Catalando, and Paul Rudolph. And he claims that it was a great semester. The chair at the time was Lawrence Anderson, who was an early proponent of the international style in the US. And so this really set him on the path to think about modern architecture. During this time, too, he talks about issues that him and Sylvia faced getting housing in the Boston area. Housing discrimination, as you probably know, was still rampant at the time. And this goes even back to the time that he spent in Minnesota, where he actually formed the campus chapter of the NAACP and pressed the university to adopt a non-discrimination policy for student housing listings. At the time, the university maintained a database or a listing of which landlords would rent to colored people and which would not. Okay. So after graduation, he worked for an architect named Carl Koch for a time. This is a stock photo, as you can see, of Carl, and this is, that's him with one of his houses. He was briefly kind of notable for the TechBuilt Homes, which was a system of house building that really focused on material innovation, on prefabrication, on thinking about the house of the future, right? And so this is some of the book that he put out. And this is utterly, it's still contemporary. I can see this as an ad for some sort of kit home that you can still see today. And these were some examples of the TechBuilt homes. You can see that they have these very modernist floor plans, where you have tight but ample space. You have materials that were interchangeable. You have this kind of blurring from the inside and outside. Scroll through these. This is an idea of what they would call living in the attic. So instead of excavating big basements and having basements and then you lived on the first floor, they actually brought the basements up to kind of half grade, and you have this big roof space, if you will, that you could live in. In 1959 to 1960, he supervised about 200 residences that were constructed under this TechBuilt framework. The TechBuilt system didn't really take off so much, but a lot of the principles, in flat pack or prefabricated construction, building houses really quickly, would really set the stage for a lot of suburban development in the U.S. And then you can see this one has this kind of crazy deck that comes out the living room. This is another TechBuilt home. I really love these pictures, which brings us to the Cole's house and studio. So this was, I guess, probably the first Cole's building that I went into. I had found out about it when there was an estate sale early last year. Robert lives at High Point now. He's no longer physically mobile enough to live in this house, but you can see the similar structure from the TechBuilt houses. You have this very generous deck system. A lot of the components in the house were pre-cut. You have this very modern entry court This is a sculpture by one of his friends, Jack Solomon, who is a sculptor, and it represents him and Sylvia. You get it. This is just the site plan of the home. So it's on Humboldt Parkway. It's not far from Main Street, and there is this kind of, this is the street where you have the entrance court, where in this picture is over here. And it has this pretty curious design for 1961 especially. There's an entry court where the living space is upstairs. You have a living room, and then his studio and office were out in the front. And there's dining, workroom downstairs, and this big terrace that comes out the back. And again, thinking about this no basement sign, all the utilities were kind of shunted in this room down here, and that negated the need to excavate an expensive basement. Here's some pictures that I took. This was at the estate sale, so you can see this is a lot of his models, and this kind of west-facing windows in the studio. This was the upstairs living space that was staged for the sale, and it's really an amazing living space. Here's a few more pictures, and this is the street. This is that it fronts. This is Humboldt Parkway, or what remains of Humboldt Parkway. The expressway is just across here, and this is the entry court. And so the house was really designed in anticipation of the Kensington Expressway coming in. He notes that there was a kind of irony that he was working for one of the engineering firms that was building the highway at the time. So he had known that, this was happening, and so the house was really designed as a response to that, where it shies away from the street, it shies away from the front, and then it opens up into this kind of amazing courtyard and this like upper deck in the back. So we'll just cycle through. This image on the left is from I found from the filing for the National Register of Historic Places nomination, and this was taken before the trees were cut down for the parkway. So you can see, this is like what it might have been. And then, of course, I think those of us in this room know about what happened afterwards. And I think his house is just past over here. Here's some more old pictures. Look at this groovy kitchen. This kitchen is like, and this clock over here. These are some pictures of the upstairs living space, before, during, and then more recently, the house was purchased by Omar Khan and Laura Garofalo, who are here today. They're professors at the UB School of Architecture, and it was a real win to be able to have the house in good hands, and see that they've converted it into this lovely kind of skylit workspace over here. So we're going to jump ahead a little bit. Let's see if there's anything. So this house was really kind of like a manifesto, if you will, for his architectural thought and his practice. He talked about how you could create a positive urban experience even in difficult circumstances, and that would be kind of the case throughout most of his architectural career. He thought that private spaces in the new society would become smaller as public spaces became larger. And this was at the beginning of the 60s, which was a time that I remember fondly. and the book talks about, it was a time in which Americans still believed that by creating, beautiful and orderly places, that the federal government could facilitate, could ameliorate the lives of urban residents living in blighted neighborhoods and give them hope for the future. So this house was built because he came back to Buffalo. And this is what the professor told him. You can make what you will of this statement. It may be a little problematic in some sense. But Coles was invited to come back to Buffalo by the director of the Urban League at the time, who was himself trained as an architect, and who had seen his design for the Ellicott District Recreation Center and invited Coles to come back to build it. And so he came, he talks about how he came back for 3 months, and he came back for 6 months, and then he was like, you know what, I'm coming back to Buffalo. And then this is what was built in 1963, and this was actually his master's thesis project, which is pretty incredible to think that you could have your master's thesis project built in your home city. This is located on the east side in the Ellicott District. It's still there today. This is a more recent picture. This is one that I took the other day.
What street is it at?
It is on Clinton Street.
Thank you.
Yeah, so it's on Clinton Street, just not far from downtown. He designed the building to include all sorts of functions. There was a gym in there, there were social spaces, there were daycare spaces, there's an art space. Nowadays, it's mostly an athletic center, and there's a pool, there's courts behind it. It's pretty well used. These are some pictures of the model. I really like these models. And that was what started Robert Traynham Cole's PC. So his firm, after building the recreation center, his firm opened in 1963, and at the time of its dissolution in 2012, it was the oldest African-American owned architecture firm in New York and in the Northeast. And then, so another little quote that I'll read to you is that he thought that architecture was an urban art, and that to be successful, the student needed to immerse himself in the social issues of the city and its people before he thought about designing buildings. And so, in some sense, this project is also emblematic of that. The forms are pretty plain or simple. These buildings are not loud or flashy, but you can see in the material, kind of the material palette, and the idea of how the programs were laid out, that it was really a social building. And the next year, 1964, is when President Lyndon Johnson signed the War on Poverty bill. So this was really a time when it was thought that, we could really do this. This is a year apart. And so in the early days of the practice, I'm just gonna kind of cycle through some of the buildings that or spaces. This is actually, was Solomon Court, and this is actually on the corner of Allen and Elmwood, where Cantina Loco is now. The building was occupied by Jack Solomon, the sculptor that we talked about before, and he had invited him to do this courtyard. Was a semi-public space. People gathered, had concerts there. He put his sculptures out there, and now it's a margarita garden. So.
Is it the actual building or the back of the building?
So yeah, so this is the back of the building. So this would be Elmwood right here, and right now, this is the kind of the patio area for Cantina Loco, which is something that I did not know. So it was interesting to find out. This is the Joseph J. Kelly housing complex. This set of buildings is still around. He designed a playground for the Chautauqua Institute. This playground was closed in dismantled because they were worried that kids were going to hit themselves on the steel or whatever. He designed a few residential projects, small residential projects that in many ways echo the TechBuilt homes. And to me, these drawings they just look like Paul Rudolph buildings to me. You have this crazy pitch roof. You have another one. This one looks like the Shoreline Apartments on Niagara Street. But ultimately, these residential projects did not really interest him so much. And this was in the 60s, where at the time, in 1964, there was huge riots in Rochester, and then in 65 in Watts. And it really reaffirmed his conviction that as an architect, he had some role to play in improving schools, housing, neighborhoods, community centers, and so eventually he shied away from a lot of these projects. As a side note, this is Buckminster Fuller. He had worked with Buckminster Fuller on a number of different projects. At the time, they worked with Louis G. Harriman, who was a banker in Buffalo, and I think Harriman Hall at UB is named after him. They collaborated on a dome stadium for the Bills that was never materialized. There was a series of projects in Toronto that were these kind of visionary tetrahedral structures that didn't happen. And then they worked together on a physical education complex for UB, which has, you can see this kind of big dome. And according to Coles, he was very enthusiastic about the project. They had this whole kind of philosophy about athletics and its place in the university. It's this totally enclosed scheme. The State University Construction Fund, which it sounds like a familiar story even today, he claims lacked the creative insights to appreciate Fuller. And so Buckminster Fuller withdrew from the project, and he said that. Again, these are, keep in mind, these are quotes from the 60s, but this is really quite telling. So when Fuller bowed out of the project, Coles took on the project himself, and eventually built what we know as Alumni Arena today. And this is Coles with the photo of the arena under construction. At the time, and I think even now, it's the biggest meeting space that's available in the university system. I think I read that only the Syracuse basketball stadium is bigger than Alumni Arena. It was built in, this is what it looks like now. It has this really unfortunate thing on it. This is the stadium. So it was built in two phases. The first phase included the courts and the gym, and the second phase included the natatorium, which was the aquatic facilities, as you can see here. This was a picture that I took in 2013 when President Obama came to speak at UB. I don't know if any of you remember 2013. It was a very long time ago. Racism was over. But so I thought that it was an interesting coincidence that I don't think many people know that really the biggest building on the SUNY campus was designed by a black architect. This is me, my parents. We'll fast forward. And it's interesting, to think that as a student, really, aside from maybe a few classes here and there, I never set foot in there. But eventually, most students will pass through this building, and so I guess Coles has had the last laugh. This was a picture of his firm in the early 70s. So he was, committed to social justice both in his practice but also in who came through the practice, as you can see. And this is Whitney Young Jr. This was, he had kind of a lot of overlap with with Coles. When Coles studied in Minnesota, Young was actually the director of the St. Paul Urban League, and he gave this fiery speech in 1968 to the American Institute of Architects. This is probably like the most commonly quoted section from that speech. But he talks about he railed against a lot of things. Kind of these vertical slums that he referred to that architects were building in cities to house the remaining black population. At the same time, they were building suburban developments backed by the government for white residents to move out. And so, this really, Coles was in the audience for this speech, and really took it up. Let's see. And so then we move into this section about his advocacy. It's a really detailed story that's told in the book, and I don't want to recount the whole story, but we'll just look at some pictures. This is Richard Prosser. Richard Prosser was the director of the he was a Presbyterian minister, he was an organizer, and he was an associate of Saul Alinsky. He had come from Chicago to be the director of Friendship House, which was a settlement house in Lackawanna. And he invited Coles to design the project. These are a couple views of the model. The building had, it fulfilled lots of functions. It had programs, food pantry, foster care, summer camp. Notably, it had no exterior windows. And when I asked Coles about it, he said, well, the site was surrounded by slag piles. And so, and when I saw this model, I immediately thought of something else. This is the Bunshaft building at the Albright Knox. I mean, just thought I'd drop it in there. He was involved with many kind of community organizations. In 1965, they invited Saul Alinsky to visit Buffalo and kind of address different ways that they were going to address grievances within the African American community. They formed an organization called BUILD, which stands for Build Unity, Independence, Liberty, and Dignity. And they also formed kind of an ally organization, if you will, called CAUSE, which was the Coalition for Action, Unity, and Social Equality. I particularly like the cigarette that's in his finger here. And then you'll notice in this picture, he has a shirt from the Jesse Jackson campaign for president in, 1984. Interesting to note that although Jesse Jackson didn't come up with the term, he popularized the Rainbow Coalition, which in many ways forms the basis of how we think about social activism today in terms of an intersectional approach, in terms of opening these organizations up from just being limited to the Black community and involving other minorities in this sort of pan-minority coalitions that we think about how we use the terms like people of color today. And that's all coming from a lot of these developments in the 70s. I love this extreme 70s graphics of the Community Planning Assistance Center that he helped set up. And it was a response to a time where he was the only Black architect and he was constantly being asked to provide services to the community in terms of community design, community development, and so they set up this organization that would help on that work. This is Harriman, as we talked about before. The poster reads, "Happiness is a waterfront university." Coles led the committee for an urban campus. In the 60s, when UB was mulling moving to Amherst, the campaign ultimately failed, as we know, but he thought that it was just nonsensical to have this huge waterfront site in the city and not build a university on it. Anyway, the story There are some pretty good articles about it if you want to look it up. Ultimately, he failed, but like he then built Alumni Arena. So we're zooming ahead because it's 7:45. This is a rendering for a African American Museum and Cultural Center in Niagara Falls that was never built. Again, I'm struck by this very Rudolph-esque thing in the background. I don't know what this is, but I just thought this was a cool rendering. And there was this kind of, it says, Cole's memory of the presentation about the project in the Niagara Falls City Council chamber was not a happy one. Yeah. This was in the early 1970s, yeah. And this is what he was told. And so as we get into the 70s, it really was not a good time for his firm and for a lot of other people. In 1973, Nixon placed a moratorium on funding for public housing, and that really dried up a lot of black architects' careers because those were the biggest projects that they could get, and those were the types of projects that sustained them at a time where they were in no way going to get commissions by wealthy white clients and so on. And then, of course, later, funding for transportation projects, for community centers, and then on to the Reagan administration. Those were really kind of fallow times. And so I think at this point, his work shifted a lot into more advocacy work and really trying to push for more representation of black architects in the profession, which remains stubbornly low. I have heard and I know that he was a constant thorn in the side of the UB Architecture School for not admitting or graduating enough black architecture students, and there was quite a bit about that in the book as well. But at this time, he was able to sustain his practice by delving into a lot of joint ventures, and so working with other firms on bigger projects. This was a Center for Municipal Affairs in Washington, D.C., and this was built in an urban renewal site, and it housed a lot of government functions, and the idea was that, again, thinking about the program of bringing government services into a neighborhood that did not have them previously. There was rumblings a few years ago that the DC was going to swap the building for some stadium land or something like that, but so far it's still there. And one thing that I really enjoyed looking at when I was doing my research on his buildings was going to, let's say, the locations on Instagram and seeing what pictures that people post of it. And most of them aren't of the architecture, but just what people were doing in these buildings, voting, getting their licenses renewed or whatever. Here is a couple buildings that he did also as joint ventures in New York City. There's a school, and these are they have these very postmodern features that start coming up in the design. This is a metro station in Atlanta, the Lindbergh Center. I have another picture. You'll notice the colored glass panels, which are going to come back in a minute, and this use of really simple materials, but generous spaces. This is a train station in Providence, and one thing that kind of was a bomb in some sense was the Secretary of Transportation from 1975 to 77, which was William Thaddeus Coleman, and he mandated that 15% of funds for mass transit had to go to minority firms. And so these are a lot of the projects that came out of that. This was a station, Providence Railway Station, that was done in conjunction with SOM, and it has this, again, this crazy kind of postmodern dome that echoes the state capitol behind it, and this weird brutalist clock tower. I think it's a pretty nice dome. And a couple more. And so I think that even though train travel is really not that prevalent in the U.S. today, there's still this romance associated with the Great American Train Station, and so this was one of the projects that he was quite proud of as well. And then here in Buffalo, he designed with a joint venture with another firm, VVKR, Utica Station, and that's where we did the project. It's a very unassuming building. Most people probably think it's quite ugly. I happen to like it a lot. Special note here, the bronze benches by Scott Burton that I know, Ed, you're interested in, that were previously housed at Allen Station were moved there. And then I guess this is where I get on my soapbox, which is that the NFTA has been mulling a plan to redevelop a lot of the train stations the way that they did Allen Station, essentially by demolishing the buildings and putting something else on them. And I think that it's really a wrong-headed move. A lot of these stations are really unique. I mean, every station is a unique work of architecture. And they have these amazing interior spaces. And this is a theme that comes up again and again, where they have these, really boring or kind of, a lot of people find ugly exteriors, but they have really quite generous spaces for the people who actually use them. And this was some pictures from our project where we put up works of art in the ad space on the ticket machines. If you go to Utica Station on a weekday from like 3 o'clock, there are students everywhere, there are cops everywhere, unfortunately. But I think it's a testament to just how successful of a social space it is, that all these kids congregate there, they wait for their buses, they have this great kind of space, and then they have this plaza out front. And here is the connection to El Museo. This is Lenore Bethel. She died unexpectedly in 2009, but she was the curator of El Museo, and this was one of the shows that she did with him. Another metro project, the train yards downtown. The maintenance facilities were renovated in part by Kohl's. This is the Metro Operations Control Center. That's where all the nerve center of the system is. He mentioned that he designed it similar to a metro train, and it was designed with a public gallery, but I don't think that was ever used. The idea was that you could have people kind of go in and see how the system is functioning. And this is the big light scoop. It looks like it's been painted white. This is out of order, but this is the Whitney Young Jr. citation, which was an award that he was particularly proud of. And then, so what time is it? I have a few minutes left. So this is just a list of the buildings projects that he worked on or built or did designs for. As you can see, a lot of them are in Buffalo, and it was something that I noticed once I started paying attention to these buildings, that they are everywhere. He was the only black architect in the city for a very long time, and so many of these projects, really felt his firm. And so we'll just, at this point, I'm just gonna cycle through some images of some of his architecture per se, and like I said, he didn't talk very much, or he doesn't talk very much in the book or in person about his designs. He would simply say that he was a contemporary architect and he built in the style of the time, and which again reflects this idea that really the function and the program of his buildings was way more important to him, and the types of social relations that it was able to house than the buildings themselves. but they're built in this very specific style. And most of these buildings are still around. This is a little clinic. It's right on Main Street. This is Joseph J. Kelly Gardens, which is a senior housing complex. You can see, again, these very modernist designs, but very generously spaced. It faces away from the street, from this busy avenue, and there's a manufacturing facility across the street, and then it creates these courtyards for residents. This is the William Emsley YMCA. The original, this replaced, not replaced, but there was a YMCA building that was designed by John Brent, whom we saw earlier, that was torn down, and this was, in a way, his replacement for it. Again, these really kind of inscrutable street facades, but I think that it's hard for me or us to imagine today, but there definitely was a time when people did not want to have, glass and ground floor retail everywhere. And there was this idea of really turning away from the city into a sanctuary, and also thinking of street life as not just commercial. And one thing that I really enjoy about these buildings is the square brick that I think that his logo alludes to a lot of the time. These very simple forms that they create really nice atmospheric effects. This is right a kitty corner from the street from that building. This is the Jesse E. Nash Health Center today. Here's some pictures of the models. Here's some pictures of what they look like. I particularly like this kind of very sculptural form. So this is here, and then that's the YMCA over there. This is a school it's on Oneida Street. It's kind of near Larkinville. It's a public school. It's now a Buff Science, what's it called? Oh, here it is. Buffalo Academy of Science. Unfortunately, no offense to Chuck Tingley, it's been painted over with these murals, I think last year, and also that there are these air conditioning units that have punctured the brick walls, but in some ways that looks kind of cool too. I think that's one of the strengths of these buildings, is that they don't need to be pristine, and they can really take up to this. Here, I'm just going to cycle through these real quick. This was like a really ambitious project. I believe it was in the early 70s, right before all the funding for housing was starting to get cut off. And you can see this is an urban renewal map of the city. This is the waterfront redevelopment area, downtown renewal, and Ellicott District development district. And Ellicott District was really where a lot of his projects were. And he created this plan that was meant to fill in a lot of the space. So much of the district was cleared, part of a slum clearance project, and they built these two big tower complexes, Ellicott Mall and Talbot Mall, but they never filled in the rest, and so it was this really kind of horrible area. And proposed a lot of, again, it's very modernist, generously proportioned. You have houses that create courtyards between them. You have designated areas for community functions, for retail. The scale of it is just a little staggering. This is William Street. And what's interesting to me is that if you go down William Street today, in terms of urban form, a lot of it is like that. It just wasn't built in this style. They built these like suburban-looking townhomes fronting William Street. And so this is really, I guess, an urban plan. And these are some renderings. Um, these are some floor plans. I mean, if you look at this, these floor plans are in many ways a lot better for living in than a lot of the new apartments that we see coming up in Buffalo that have no bedroom windows. Again, this playing with the grade, the half basement, to sneak in extra bedrooms into the low-rise housing. Let's see. Here are a couple of projects on the west side. This one is, this is just kooky, but I like it. A couple of projects on the east side, the Wiley Pavilion. This is the city media center, and that's around his final project that was built in 2006, which was, I think, probably to him his kind of magnum opus. This is the Meriwether Library at Jefferson, and it was built referencing an African village. And this is really interesting to me because it totally breaks the mold of some of his previous projects. And we land in this really kind of firmly postmodern territory where it's kind of referencing something else, and there this idea of the African American experience as being tied to Africa. I mean, this is and I'll just cycle through these pictures. These pictures are by David Gordon, and again, you have this this building that is really mostly closed off to the street, but it has these amazing spatial qualities inside. Here are the colored panels, which cast on ever-changing shadows on the space. So that's the main circulation desk that sits in the heart of the building here. And once again, this kind of very sensitive material palette. And again, something that is interesting to me that I notice about the building every time I go there is that it's a round building, but it's made up of blocks. And I mean, it's a really simple kind of material trick, but it works. And so, so just thinking about, I'm gonna settle on, we'll settle on this one. Just thinking about these buildings, if we think about modernism and modern buildings, modern architecture in Buffalo, there are the big famous examples, right? We have the buildings downtown, Minoru Yamasaki. You have the Frank Lloyd Wright House, which is like, it's okay. But outside of that, really the only kind of stock of modern architecture that exists in the city, most of them are by Coles. And it's this layer in the city that is really fascinating, and thinking about the way that he both chose his projects and managed to have enough projects to sustain a firm just out of community centers and schools and community facilities, and thinking about using architecture in that way, that he was in some ways only able to achieve because of racial discrimination, which is this weird, I don't know how to describe it, right? And that a lot of these really kind of revolutionary ideas were stopped in their tracks pretty quickly when Americans turned away from public funding for things that we see here. It's unimaginable today to think about hiring an architect to design a nice community center for wherever, and that his thought about how the cities were going to change, his thoughts about how architecture were going to change, in many ways they did not pan out the way that he might have wanted to. And a lot of these buildings, if I may stray into the realm of psychoanalysis here, are in some ways a metaphor for the Black experience, where you have a facade that is in some ways inscrutable or very opaque, but then you have this amazing kind of interior that only the people who go into these buildings can experience, right? So as you notice, a lot of these shots were external shots other than the buildings that I have been to or I have access to. And so I'm wondering if we could even think about Black modernism in this way, whereas there are many parallels for this idea of African or Black modernism in other disciplines, in literature and art, in architecture, because it's so it's primarily an abstract art. It's very hard to read into, but so that's really an open question that I would just like to leave there, and then if anyone has any thoughts or questions or comments, there's a lot more that I can't cover here, but if you're interested, you can get this book. It's available at every single public library branch, which this one is from. So there. Thank you. So.
Well, just one little thought that your comment is interesting, thinking about his own house, because as you talked about it, it does have quite an opaque face to the street, and I've always thought of that relative to the highway that he knew would be coming. But there is something also about, that would fit your description of something that is maintaining an inscrutable exterior and a great openness to its rear garden. So that kind of.
Here, I'll put you on.
Not necessary. True. Yeah. So that contrast is really that's another way to read that contrast is your own description.
Right. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I didn't look closely, and it wouldn't really tell us much anyway, but at the photograph of the staff when it was big, but clearly as part of advocacy, he was advocating for the place of African Americans in the profession, and I was just curious if you know how have in Buffalo at least. Did his practice launch any careers? Is there any kind of significant change in the representation of African Americans or other minorities at all in the architecture profession?
Yeah, there's actually a section in the book that I wasn't able to include in here that had a list of African American interns and architects who came through his office. In terms of where they are afterwards, I don't really know. But I think that, and this doesn't really answer your question, but it's more of a tangent. He really found his place, if you will, in the professions. In this way that he thought that, and this is my read, that having more Black architects or more Black professionals would bring about social change, not as a matter of simple representation, but because the professional class had access to people, they had access to money, to politics, that are not open to, say, a regular person. And in many ways, that progress on that front has slowed. Right, but he really was a radical in the way that he, and if we think about the quote about, going back to the hinterlands, I mean, we can quibble about that, but in that sense, he was a class traitor, right? He could have, he went to MIT. He could have ascended the ranks and blazed a trail doing, humongous structures. And of course, the reason he wasn't able to do that was because those doors weren't open to him. But I think that in some sense, that's also a challenge to people who might, are on a really smooth path in life and being able to say, you know what, I could go out and make all this money, but what I actually want to do is go home and build community centers. Yeah.
Can you remind me, Bryan, where is the estate or the archive? Is that with him, or is it going somewhere?
That I really don't know. I know that he had a show at the Birchfield a number of years ago, and I think they have some of the stuff in his archive. Some of his papers are, I forgot if they were at Howard or Tuskegee University. The models are in the house. But other than that, I actually don't know where a lot of the archives are. And a lot of the work is like pre-digital, so yeah.
He said that much of the is at the state.
Okay.
That he had
Right.
drawings and things like that. That's good.
Yeah, I didn't have time to go rifle through the drawings, but they would have made a good addition to this. Claire?
I just think you should give this talk at the Merriweather Library. It's such an amazing branch, and like the clientele there, and you just get a different audience, and I think
Yeah.
appreciate all this work I've done.
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, this was the first go, so.
Well, yeah.
Anyone else? Thoughts, questions, comments? Well, thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.